Namaste, hello, good evening to all present here, and greetings to all who have joined from different time zones in this very special conference. Welcome back to the final plenary session of the English Literature Summit 2023, an international virtual conference on English literature organized by ISEL and MIT ADT Pune. Honestly speaking, it has been an intellectual bonanza till now, with a plethora of discussions on various topics. As we head towards a yet another interesting session, may I kindly request my technical team to please relay an introductory AV on our distinguished speaker for the session, Professor Angus Nicholls, Professor of Comparative Literature and German, and Director of Research for Comparative Literature and Modern Languages at Queen Mary University of London. Over to my technical team.
Dr. Angus Nicholls is a distinguished academic specializing in comparative literature and German studies, currently serving as a professor of comparative literature and German at Queen Mary University of London. With over 18 years of experience at the institution, he has made significant contribution to the field. Prior to his professorship, Sir held the position of Reader in German and Comparative Literature, Department Chair of Comparative Literature and Chair of the Department of Comparative Literature and Culture at Queen Mary University. He started his academic career as a lecturer in German and Comparative Literature, later becoming a senior lecturer in the same subject. Before joining Queen Mary University, he served as the Clausian-Simon Foundation Research Lecturer in German and Comparative Literature. In addition to his academic roles, Angus has been actively involved in editorial work. He served as the co-editor of publications of the English Goethe Society at Taylor and Francis Group and as a co-editor of History of the Human Sciences at Say's Publications, demonstrating his commitment to advancing scholarly publications in the field. With his extensive academic experience, research contributions, and leadership roles, Angus Nicholls is highly regarded in the field of comparative literature and German studies. His work continues to shape scholarly discourse and inspire future generations of scholars in the United Kingdom and beyond. We welcome Dr. Angus Nicholls to EL Summit 2023.
We are indeed honored to have Sir amongst us for this unique plenary session on the relationship between literary studies and folklore studies from the perspective of anthropology during the late 19th century. The study of lore is significant for the anthropologists to understand the structural and functional dimensions of society. The study is equally effective for the literature scholars to appreciate the mechanism to reconstruct ancient beliefs, customs, and rituals in a dynamic society. The importance of folklore and folklore studies was recognized globally in 1982 in the UNESCO document Recommendation on the Safeguarding of Traditional Culture and Folklore. UNESCO, again in 2003, published a convention for the safeguarding of the intangible cultural heritage. So, we are indeed excited to listen to you, sir, on your perspectives on what exactly is the relationship between the two studies from the lens of the 19th century. Before I formally hand over the session to our erudite scholar, I would like to encourage our esteemed audience to ask questions in the Q&A panel or post it in the chat that you can see on your screens so that we can take them towards the end of this expert talk. Now, time to hear from Professor Nicholls. Over to you, sir.
Can you hear me well?
Yes, you're
Okay,
absolutely
great.
audible. Thank you.
Thank you very much for that very detailed and also generous introduction, and also the care with which the video presentation was put together. Thank you very much. That's the first time I've ever been introduced in that way, and I appreciate it. I'm going to try now to share my screen with you. Just bear with me a second, because I do have a PowerPoint presentation. And just bear with me a sec. Okay, can you see my slides now?
It is visible, sir.
Okay, great. Thank you very much. Thank you for the invitation. What I'm going to say today has some crossover, I think, already with the very good talks by Martin Puchner and Kira Vaklovic. I'm going to be talking a little bit about the transmission of culture, and I'm also going to be focusing on the Victorian period largely. So that's certainly of interest. Just a warning, a content warning to begin with, that some of the sources, these are 19th century sources that I'm discussing, so they do contain language which is outdated and to some extent racist as well. Just want to make that clear. Okay, so I want to begin by asking a question: why should we even care about the relationship between literary studies and folklore studies in the late 19th century? I want to make a case now for what I'm going to call presentist intellectual history. By presentist, I mean that we're viewing documents from the past in terms of how they affect us today. And the quote, you'll probably know this source. It's from a famous essay by Walter Benjamin called On the Concept of History. And I have the German there for you, but you can read the English as well. It's a rather loose translation that I've given because I want to move this quote a little bit in my own direction. He says, "The true image of the past flits by only as an image that flares up as never to be seen again. In the very moment of its recognizability, can the past be held onto. It is an irretrievable image of the past that threatens to disappear in every present that does not recognize itself as being meant," by which Benjamin means referred to, spoken to, addressed by that image of the past. So Benjamin is writing against a naive German historicism of the 19th century, that of Leopold von Ranke, that sees history as an objective science, the aim of which is to try to reconstruct how things really were objectively. Benjamin thinks we can't do that because we are always already in history, not standing outside of it. The way we see the past is always informed by our present. The real past is irretrievable to us, but historical documents still speak to us today and address our present day concerns. And that's why I'm looking at these 19th century sources. Exploring the history of literary studies as a field does not only tell us how we got where we are today, it also shows us how key moments of discipline formation continue to mark the field in which we work now. So some of these questions that are being asked in the late 19th century, we're still asking now, like, why do we compare one literature with another? What should we compare? And also, can you use translation to compare different literatures from different languages? The 19th century, and especially its last 3 decades, so roughly 1870 to 1900, can be seen as the period of discipline formation for literary studies as a field. That's when it began to be taught in universities. And my claim today is that during these periods of discipline formation, new fields rely on older fields and also other fields to establish their authority. This was certainly the case for literary studies, and especially for comparative literary studies, my subject today, which relied on earlier comparative methods taken from other sciences. And these other sciences themselves were also in the process of being formed during this period. For today's talk, those other sciences are anthropology and folklore studies, which were interwoven with one another during this period, roughly 1870 to 1900. They were very closely bound up. What was anthropology then? Well, for much of the 19th century, anthropology meant physical anthropology. In other words, it meant the study of race and racial differences. Folklore studies represented one of the early cultural offshoots of anthropology. In other words, it was a bit like the textual or philological side of anthropology. And because folklore studies had to do with interpreting national textual traditions and comparing them, it was close to literary studies, or what was then known as philology. Just trying to change my slide here, just 1 second. Here, a key figure in my talk, but it's going to take me a while to get to him, sorry, is Franz Boas, the German-American anthropologist who is credited with having debunked physical anthropology, the anthropology of race, replacing it with cultural anthropology. As I will show, Boas is linked to the history of literary studies because he edited this journal, which is on your screen, the Journal of American Folklore, which was first published in 1888. But in order to explain all of that to you, I need to do a little history of comparative literature as well. And at least in the English-speaking world, comparative literature has an origin story that tends to overlook the 19th century. This is especially the case in the USA, where the second coming of comparative literature after World War II has tended to overshadow its earlier 19th century origins. And one example of this is someone who'll be well known to an Indian audience, Gayatri Spivak, in her book of 2003, Death of a Discipline. In case you're wondering, the discipline that's dying or dead is comparative literature. And Spivak writes here, the origin of US comparative literature had something of a relationship with the events that secured it. The flights of European intellectuals, including such distinguished men as Erich Auerbach, Leo Spitzer, René Wellek, from totalitarian regimes in Europe. She then continues, area studies belong to foreign areas. Comparative literature was made up of Western European nations. This distinction between areas and nations infected comparative literature from the start. Now, like any good deconstructionist, Spivak has the good sense to put the word origin inside quote marks, because I think her claim here is simply wrong, or at best it's partly right. In what senses is she right, first of all? She's definitely right in a number of ways. It's true to say that comparative literature was revived in the USA after World War II by the émigré scholars who she mentions there in red on the slide, those names. It's also true to say that these figures had very little interest in the non-European world. They were European philologists. And finally, Spivak is also right about the neo-colonial infection that she sees as having marked comparative literature prior to its post-colonial critique. For much of the 20th century, the study of literature in Western conflict programs was dominated, and to some extent still is dominated, by European languages and texts. Area studies, which usually focused on non-Europe and the Eastern Bloc, was the preserve of political science and anthropology. But Spivak is wrong in her claim that comparative literature began in the US after World War II. She probably knew this anyway, but I think she was making a strong rhetorical point here. So on this slide, you can see some of the early history of comparative literature in the USA. As this slide shows, the first complete program in the US was taught at Cornell in 1871. The first chair in the field was at Harvard in 1890. His name was Arthur Richmond Marsh. The first department was established at Columbia in 1899, and they even launched a journal there in 1903, which lasted only a year. The highlighted elements of this slide show two important events for my paper. In red, at the bottom of the screen there, we see that in 1877, the first journal for comparative literature in the world, the Acta Comparationis Literarum Universarum, which was published from Cluj in present-day Romania, was founded. And in yellow, at the top of the screen there, you will see that in 1888, the Journal of American Folklore, my subject for today, was founded with Franz Boas as its editor-in-chief. Now, I want to persuade you why the Journal of American Folklore belongs along this timeline, that is, a timeline about the history of comparative literature. What was US comparative literature in the late 19th century, and what were its main features? Let's have a look at two early definitions of the field. The first is by Charles Mills Gailey, who was Professor of English and Dean of UCLA in Berkeley. The text is from an article published in The Dial, in which he proposes to establish a society for comparative literature. He says, an association should be formed for the comparative investigation of literary growths in time by systematization of results, an induction to the common and therefore essential characteristics of the phenomenon, to the laws governing its origin, growth, and differentiation may be made. The specific principles must be based upon the characteristics of the type, not only in well-known, but also in less known literatures, among Aboriginal as well as civilized people, and in all stages of evolution. So the second quote is by Arthur Richmond Marsh, the first chair of Comp Lit in the US at Harvard. And in an article published in the PMLA in 1896, he attempted a definition of the field, which he thinks is to examine the phenomena of literature as a whole, to compare them, to group them, to classify them, to inquire into the causes of them, to determine the results of them. This is the true task of comparative literature, he thinks. Now, just looking at the keywords that I've highlighted on these two quotes, we can see what kind of a field we're dealing with. Early comparative literature sees itself as an empirical science. It is concerned with the causes and origins of literature, with its growth and evolution, with classifying its types, and even with identifying its laws. These laws and classifications must be based on inductions from the widest possible range of data, which is why so-called Aboriginal and civilized sources must be examined. The so-called primitive or Aboriginal sources, the folk materials as it were, are seen as important because they are thought to reveal the evolutionary origins of literature. So this empirical and natural scientific focus of early comparative literature was not just confined to the USA. On this slide, you can read the laws of comparative literary research, which were formulated by the editors of the first journal in the field, the Acta Comparationis. I've reproduced the first 4 of their 9 laws here. You can read the German text on the slide. In my briefer English paraphrase, the basic laws are as follows. First, prose is mechanistic, poetry is organic, and the organic is very important here. Second, studied artistic literature is also merely mechanistic. One should therefore only compare oral folk songs, not written fairy tales like those collected by the Grimms. And then finally, prose cannot emigrate organically. True poetry moves around as an organism, puts down roots, and generates organic variants. Related to this emphasis on so-called organic or primitive folk materials was a conception of world literature which seems rather distant to us today. This slide is also from the Acta Comparationis and presents the journal's call for materials for an encyclopedia of the poetry of the world. The emphasis here, as you see on the quote, is on polyglot or panglot coverage rather than on a canon of masterpieces. In other words, we're dealing with a much wider and much less canon-focused notion of world literature here. And the call specifically asks not for so-called refined literature, but rather for popular song. In German, they want primarily oral Volkslieder or folk songs. The extent to which early comparative literature and folklore studies were allied disciplines is also seen on this slide from the Acta Comparaciones. It is a circular from the South African Folklore Society, so deeply colonial context, asking for so-called exceptionally primitive examples of African folklore. The idea is to preserve these traditions because it's presumed, again in a very colonial way, that the sources will die out with contact with European modernity. And here, folklore studies, and this is important, is conceived as a contribution to something called a science of man. In other words, what we're dealing with here in early comparative literature, both in the US and in parts of Europe, is a deeply colonial discipline. One of the aims of this discipline was to produce a kind of museum of world literature. What then unites these early efforts with the Journal of American Folklore? Now, our key word here is salvage, right? Martin, in some ways, talked about this today. In a well-known article, Jacob Gruber refers us to the idea of ethnographic salvage, the colonial idea, essentially, of preserving so-called primitive traditions that were thought to be faced with extinction following contact with European modernity. And the Journal of American Folklore exists completely within this tradition of salvage. This is its mission statement from the first article in the journal, the first issue. It sets out the scientific task of collecting fast vanishing remains of folklore in America. So saving things. Of interest here, though, is that the journal aims to collect the ballads, tales, superstitions, and dialects, not just of European cultures, not just of non-European cultures, such as those of First Nations Americans, but of all America's inhabitants. So they're interested in Anglophone folklore, African American folklore, Indigenous American folklore, Francophone folklore, Mexican folklore, right? Very multicultural focus. In using the term folklore in its title, the journal invokes a then relatively new tradition in Anglophone scholarship that was associated first and foremost with the ideas of the Scottish man of letters, Andrew Lang. The key text for folklore studies was Lang's book of 1884, Custom of Myth. That slide just shows you a little bit of basic information about Lang. Lang was a very typical Victorian man of letters in that his interests combined classics, history, and folklore. He was a philologist, basically. He was a bitter opponent, though, of traditional philological approaches to myths and folklore. And instead, he favoured evolutionist anthropology, especially the ideas of his Oxford mentor, Edward Burnett Tyler. The extent of this devotion to Tyler can be seen on this slide, which shows that Custom and Myth, which is Lang's most famous book, was dedicated to Tyler, not just on a personal level, but also in terms of method. He even goes so far as to name Tyler's book Primitive Culture under his dedication. So what then is the method of folklore in Lang's view? Here, and forgive me, a long quotation is in order. And in this quote, Lang is attempting to explain the apparent similarities between contemporary Aboriginal Australian myths about the stars and ancient Greek myths on the same subject. Let's have a look. He says, there is another possible way of explaining the resemblance of the Greek and Australian Pleiad myth about the stars. The hypothesis will be that the myth or usage is common to both races, not because of original community of stock, not because of contact and borrowing, but because the ancestors of the Greeks passed through the same savage intellectual condition in which we find the Australians. In the following essays, then, the myths and customs of various people will be compared, even when these people talk languages of alien families and have never been in actual contact. Our method throughout will be to place the usage or myth, which is unintelligible when found among a civilized race, beside the similar myth, which is intelligible enough when it is found among savages. Now, very offensive, very racist, very colonial language. From viewing the terms that I've highlighted here in red, we can see the extent to which Lang adheres to a position in evolutionist anthropology known as stadial theory. On the right-hand side of my slide, you'll see the basics of stadial theory. In English, this position was basically Tyler's idea, and it's deeply colonial and deeply Victorian as well. It's the notion that human cultures, all human cultures everywhere, evolve through the same three universal stages. In Tyler's version, these are animism or polytheism, religion, meaning monotheism, and science. Because these stages are said to be universal, one does not need to demonstrate cultural contact to explain similarities between myths. Rather, the similarity is said to exist because the myth meets similar needs of people who exist at a certain stage of cultural evolution. So if the model is a universal one, you don't need to demonstrate diffusion or contact. Lang's position existed in polemical opposition to that of people like Max Muller. Max Muller will be well known to an Indian audience for the following reasons. First, Muller and other Indo-Germanists like Franz Bock and also the Grimms were philologists who traced myth within the Indo-European family of languages. Their explanation for similarity between different traditions, for example, between ancient Greece and India, was linguistic and cultural diffusion, contact, right? The primary task of comparative mythology, according to their view, was to know the languages you are working with, to identify the similarities between language roots, and ultimately between myths. So to sum up here, we have really two very opposed traditions. We have the stadial theory of Tyler and Lang, and the diffusionist philology of Indo-Europeanists like Max Muller. Where did the Journal of American Folklore stand in this debate? This debate was hot at the time it was founded. Where did it stand? Well, it's complicated, and it's complicated probably because of Boas, but not just because of him. The journal was founded in 1888. It's still published today, with Boas as its editor-in-chief. But close beside him was a man named Thomas Frederick Crane, or T. Crane of Cornell University, as he's still known in the popular university song. There's still a Cornell song in which Crane is mentioned today. The mission statement of the journal was, I presume, jointly written by all of its editors, but it was Crane, who was a philologist, he wasn't an anthropologist, who wrote one of its early statements on method, an article called The Diffusion of Popular Tales. First of all, before I look at that article, who was Crane and why is he important for my story? Well, what's important about him is that he's a literary scholar, right? Pictured on the left there, he was a literary scholar and a scholar of Romance languages who became Dean of Arts at Cornell. And you'll recall from earlier in my paper that Cornell is meant to have been the first university in the US to offer comparative literature as a formal subject of study in 1871. On this slide, we can see a selection of Cornell exam questions for comparative literature for the academic year 1876 to 77. And it seems to me highly likely, although I haven't been able to establish this, that Crane was involved with teaching the subject at Cornell. So what we have here is Crane, the philologist and comparatist, working alongside Boas, the nascent cultural anthropologist. There's this work coming together of literary scholars and anthropologists on a folklore journal. And in this quote from Crane's essay on the diffusion of popular tales, we also see that he explicitly ties folklore studies to the discipline of comparative literature. He says, the widespread interest in popular tales is not wholly due to their intrinsic worth, but largely to the fact that they are supposed to possess a scientific value for the comparative mythologist, ethnologist, and student of comparative literature. If we assume the Indo-European or Aryan theory to be true, we must explain in some way the diffusion of Indian tales not only among non-Aryan peoples, but also among remote tribes of savages, unless indeed we are prepared to deny the substantial identity of the popular tales, customs, etc., of civilized and uncivilized peoples. And then he says, this is really important. He says, I think it is not extravagant to say that the theories of Grimm and Benfey, and to that list I would also add Max Müller, have broken down. I mean as theories to explain generally the origin and diffusion of popular tales. Fortunately, the subject to which this journal is devoted does not depend for its interest upon any theory of origin or diffusion. So what's going on here? Well, this quote demonstrates what happened to the Indo-European diffusionism, this idea of cultural contact, when it was relocated to the United States. In Crane's words, the theories of Grimm and Benfey and also Max Müller broke down because they were not able to explain the diversity of the material found in America. It was clear that First Nations Americans, Mexicans, and African Americans did not belong to the Indo-European language family. They existed outside of it. How then would it be possible to explain similarities between myths and those of Europe and India? In some cases, therefore, diffusion could be convincing, in others, less so. What is interesting about Crane's article is that he deliberately leaves the matter open. Although he mentions this debate between Max Müller and Andrew Lang, between Indo-European philology on the one hand and stadial or evolutionist theory on the other, he does not take any side in this debate. He explicitly refuses to tie the journal to any single theory of origin or diffusion. Now, this finally brings Franz Boas into view. A good deal of Boas's early career, and certainly the years between 1880 and 1910, which are of interest to me, were concerned with this debate between diffusionism and stadial theory. The key sources of what I'm going to say about Boas today are on this slide, and you'll see that they were all written around the time of the founding of the Journal of American Folklore in 1888. Some of them even appeared in that journal. Boas became progressively more skeptical about stadial theory, in my view, because he was interested in particular cultures and languages. In part, this had to do with the fact that unlike Lang and unlike Tyler, Boas actually did field work and learned some of the languages of the people whom he studied. So my question for the remainder of this paper, I've got about maybe 6 or 7 minutes to go, is the following one. What happens when we think of Franz Boas, not just as a cultural anthropologist, but also as a proto-literary comparatist? What happens when we put him in the history of literary studies? To explore this question, I have 3 hypotheses about Franz Boas that I want to share with you. Here's the first one. I'm claiming that Boas championed a philological and historicist theory of culture working within a comparative framework. So this theory is outlined in an essay that appeared in Science magazine, for which Boas was an editor, and the title of the paper is rather unpromising. It's called The Study of Geography. Why is it called that? It's called that because anthropology was not really properly defined during this time. So when Boas writes about geography, he's actually writing about anthropology. Let's read what he says about geography. He says, the fact that the most rapid disclosure of the most remote parts of the globe coincided with a not less rapid development of the physical sciences has had great influence on the development of geography. The aim of science is to deduce laws from phenomena, and the wider their scope, the more valuable they are considered. But all agree that anthropogeography, as he calls it, the life of man, is the true domain of geography, right? So he's trying to make geography into a humanistic science. He then says, we must prove that there exists another object for science besides the deduction of laws from phenomena. And it is our opinion that there is another object, the thorough understanding of phenomena. Thus, we find that the contest between geographers and their adversaries is identical with the old controversy between historical and physical methods. Now, evolutionism modeled itself after the natural sciences. What Boas is doing here is moving geography and anthropology away from that and back towards what he calls historical methods, textual methods. He proposes that the first task of anthropogeography, by which he means anthropology, is the understanding of cultures on a micro level, right? So away with the grand laws about evolution, rather immerse yourself in a culture, learn its language, understand its texts. In favouring linguistic depth, Boas's position is not a natural scientific one. It argues against the idea of geography as a physical science with definable laws. Okay, that's my first hypothesis. The second one is that Boas's historicist and philological approaches led him to reject the evolutionist comparative method of Tyler. This argument is unfolded in Boas's 1896 essay on the limitations of the comparative method. Let's read him again and see what he has to say. When studying the culture of any one tribe, more or less close analogy of single traits of such a culture may be found among a great diversity of peoples. Instances of such analogy have been collected to a vast extent by Tyler, he says. This leads to the still wider generalization that the sameness of ethnological phenomena is proof that the human mind obeys the same laws everywhere. But here lies the flaw in the arguments of the new method, for no such proof can be given. The frequent occurrence of these forms proves neither common origin, nor that they have always developed according to the same psychical laws. He then says, before extended comparisons are made, the comparability of the material must be proved. Now, the question here is, what does Boas mean by comparability of the material? It's an important question, even for us today. He means focusing on a single tribe or group or culture or language and extending work only to neighboring groups, perhaps with similar languages, or where there is evidence of contact. We see, in other words, that Boas favors a careful diffusionism and rejects grander speculations about the universal human mind and universal stages of evolution because he thinks they are too easily falsifiable. He's miles away from Lang and from Tyler here. Which then leads me to my third hypothesis, which is that Boas's historicist and philological approaches led him to reject the dominant theory of folklore during the 1880s, that of Andrew Lang. Because Boas so clearly rejects the methods of Tyler, it follows almost necessarily that he rejects Lang, who, as we have seen, was a follower of Tyler. But this gives rise to an important question. If Boas had a problem with Tyler and Lang, why did he agree to edit a journal, the Journal of American Folklore, which was so deeply tied to these evolutionist methods? My answer to that question is, at this point, the comparative method was the only game in town, right? You had to play that game within the field. Boas decided to play the game, but in such a way as to undermine its main theoretical ideas, right? So he's someone who enters the field in order to change it. This is seen in Boas's essay on the mind of primitive man. So he's using this concept of the primitive, but he uses it almost in a way to undermine it. Let's have a look at the way he does this. He says, I do not believe that we are able at the present time to form a just valuation of the power of abstraction, of control, and of choice among different races. A comparison of their languages, customs, and activities suggests that these faculties may be unequally developed. But the difference is not sufficient to justify us in ascribing material lower stages to some people and higher stages to others. So he rejects stadialism here. Our considerations make it probable that the wide differences between the manifestations of the human mind in various stages of culture may be due almost entirely to the form of individual experience, which is determined by the geographical and social environment of the individual. It would seem that in different races, the organization of the mind is on the whole alike, and that the varieties of mind found in different races do not exceed perhaps not even reach the amount of normal variation in each race. So what's going on here? It's a highly ambiguous passage. Boas spends a lot of time in this essay arguing that a cultural trait like self-control, or manners, if you like, is culturally relative. Certain situations require self-control in some cultures and not in other cultures. Smacking one's lips at a meal is considered polite in some cultures and impolite in other cultures. Observers with Eurocentric ideas about self-control can thus easily misunderstand behaviours found in non-European cultures. That's clear. A generous or normative reading of this passage, a reading from today's perspective perhaps, would extend this logic by arguing that any understanding of the concept of development or progress is also culturally relative. It would ask the question, development according to whom and according to which criteria, rather than just assuming that European criteria are the criteria of development. But in the end, Boas was an Enlightenment thinker and a European thinker, and I doubt that we can push his ideas that far. I think he probably held on to a Eurocentric notion of development. But there is no doubt at all that Boas decouples cultural development from race, and that he also rejects the idea of cultural stages outright. In short, he killed off the stadial theory of Tyler and Lang within anthropology. What am I ultimately saying then about Boas and the early history of comparative literature? I'd like to conclude today by offering you a picture of what Boas did. In 1906, he went to Ithaca, to Cornell, and he attended a meeting of the American Philological Association. I presume that Thomas Frederick Crane and his other Cornell colleagues were in the audience at that talk. Boas comes to Cornell to talk to the philologists about what anthropologists can learn from them. And the essay summarizes Boas as a thinker on the comparative method. I'm not going to read all these quotes out to you, but I'm just going to summarize them for you. First, as we see in the first quote here, Boas warns against lazy assumptions and classifications concerning so-called primitive culture, pointing to the complexities that attend even examining individual cultures, let alone comparing them. Second, he recommends a turning away from the comparative methods of the natural sciences and a turning towards historical methods. To an audience of philologists, this would have meant knowing your sources and understanding them in their historical contexts. And finally, he points to the importance of learning languages so that the sources can be understood directly. Now, this sounds to me like a relatively good program for literary studies, right? So I'm being presentist here. I'm reading this text from our perspective today. What's he saying? Make careful judgments about your sources. Know their historical contexts, and if possible, read them in the original languages that they were composed in. If you want to compare them, fine, but justify why you are making your comparison. Boas said all of these things, but he has no place within the history of comparative literature. Now, I want to end today with a note of caution. That is that there can be no whole-scale rehabilitation of Franz Boas. He's a person of his time. His context was an undeniably colonial one, and he did not escape colonial prejudices. Images like this one, taken in Minden in Germany and not in the field, show the ambivalence of his enterprise. And this speaks a little bit to what Martin said before about cultural appropriation. The image is obviously staged and presents Boas as going native to understand the Inuit culture which he'd studied. Its ambivalence, I think, suggests sympathy and respect for the culture that he is studying on the one hand, but also showiness and a wish to appropriate it and put it on display on the other. So it's definitely got a museum-like character to it. The image encapsulates what we might call the birth defect of anthropology. On this slide, which presents material from a new biography of Boas, we also learn that he too engaged in the darker practices of early anthropology. Boas exhumed human remains and sold the body parts for cash when he needed money. He sold them to museums. So by making him into the forgotten co-founder of comparative literature, we must also remember and confront its colonial origins, the site of what Spivak would call its original infection. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Thank you so much, sir. It was indeed an amazing session, a very invigorating talk, I must say. Thanks to Professor Angus Nicholls once again. And here I would like to open the platform for some questions and answers. We've received a few from our panelists, and with your permission, sir, I would like to ask a few questions to you.
Sure.
So the first goes that, because we have got some amazing insights into complete folklore studies, anthropology, so on and so forth. So with these disciplines coming together, what are the specific topics that can be explored by interested research scholars who want to delve deeper into the comparative analysis of the concepts? Or since you mentioned something called the science of man, so with this perspective, what are some particular topics, specific suggested readings that can be taken ahead by our interested scholars?
Okay, thank you very much for the question. Yeah, it's a very big topic. So some of the, I mean, on these questions, some of the best sources, maybe I can share my screen again. Some of the best sources are actually ones that Boas wrote himself. Whoops, I'm just trying to go back to the slide. He wrote very much for popular, you can find these online as well, because they're out of copyright. He wrote very much for popular audiences. So this essay, for example, in Science magazine is very short, and was written for a kind of popular educated audience, in which Boas was really trying to work out what anthropology is, right? They didn't really even know what the subject was at that point. All of these sources really are very useful to read on those topics. But I'm not quite sure what the question is. Is it historical sources that your audience is interested in, or rather contemporary ones?
I think that this particular clarification leads to the next question that we have.
Okay.
And it is something which even I really wanted to know. It's a personal question from my side, that how do you think the present generation, or if you were to call it the Gen Z, would relate to folklore or folklore studies? So with that, maybe the contemporary sources, if you could cite a few.
Sure. Yeah, so as you saw today, what I did was I offered what I was calling a presentist reading of these sources. And if you're a historian, as I'm sure the audience knows, the worst possible sin that you can commit is presentism, because what you do is you basically read the historical source as though it's written for you, rather than reading it in its original context. My argument is that because we're always already in history, you can't but be presentist, right? You always read something from your own historical perspective, but you should try to do that consciously, right? You should know that there's a difference between your perspective and that of the source. This leads me to answering your question. So these are difficult sources to write about, and that was partly why I put a content warning at the beginning of my lecture, because many of them, and especially the folklorist ones, elaborate ideas which we would today find very racist and offensive, right? For example, this idea that European culture is the most advanced culture, and that non-European cultures are less advanced. This idea of stadial theory, which was ubiquitous across Europe during that period. This is a an idea which people would find racist. And I can tell you, I even had one interaction with a student who, said, why are you asking us to read these sources? Aren't they very racist? And I said, yes, they are very racist, but you need to understand that our context today is a very different one to the one in which they were written, and that the context in which they were written is one which was the dominant context of the time. And moreover, and this is the broader claim of my talk, I don't think that we've actually surmounted this type of stadial theory, really, in Europe. I still think that it's kind of a tacit assumption. When a curriculum comes under pressure, right? We all need to make decisions about what we're going to teach because we have limited time in which to teach our texts. We all, the texts have to be available in order to teach them. In many cases, they have to be already translated. And all of those processes of selection mean that, at least in my view, still in the West, comparative literature courses are dominated by European sources, right? I'm asking, why did that happen, right? And one of the reasons why it happened was because stadial theory was such a dominant theory when the discipline was being formed, and that its subterranean influence still exists today. So I would say to Generation Z, this is part of the history of the discipline in which you're working. And in order to understand what's going on in the field that you're working in and why the curriculum that you've been given looks the way it does, part of the reasons behind that is due to this history, right? That would be my answer.
Thank you so much for rectifying those misnomers. And with this, we have another very interesting question coming up, which reads, what are some key methodologies and approaches used in anthropological research, and how do they contribute to our understanding of diverse cultures, social dynamics, and human behavior across different time periods and geographical regions? Over to you, sir.
Okay, that's a very difficult question for me to answer because I'm not an anthropologist. But I'll try and give it a go. So the sources that I was looking at in my talk today belong to the beginnings of anthropology. And what's significant about Boas, as I tried to say in my talk, is that he moved the discipline away from the study of race and physical anthropology. I mean, physical anthropology in the late 19th century involved things like measuring the size of people's skulls, right? It was very much a physical discipline. Boas himself did that too at the beginning of his career because he had to do it. But he did it in such a way to show that the variations were so minuscule that actually it doesn't make any sense to do physical anthropology, that the main differences between people are not physical, they're cultural, right? That was his main insight. In terms of today's methods, what I would say is, and I have read some, in the last year or so, I've been reading some contemporary anthropology. And one of the problems with the history of anthropology, and that's what I refer to as its birth defect, right?
Right.
Is that, in terms of Western anthropology, its birth defect involved essentially European people studying mostly non-European cultures with a colonial gaze, right? The types of anthropologists that work today, and this also, you see this as well in museum studies today, because, history of museums and history of anthropology are very much tied up with one another. That in a way, there's an attempt made to change the balance of power within that relation, right? So that if you, for example, I saw this recently in an exhibition of Aboriginal Australian culture in Berlin at the Humboldt Forum, where the exhibition had been put together collaboratively by First Nations Australians and by the people working in the museum. Or, for example, another thing that Martin mentioned to do with restitution of objects, right?
Right.
Restitution of museum objects has to be a collaborative undertaking in which the people from whom the objects were taken are deeply involved in the act of restitution, determine what happens to the objects, have a deep say in to which community they should be restituted, all of those issues. So in terms of in answer to your question, in terms of the way anthropology is moving, I think it's trying to, although it's very difficult to do this, it's trying to move away from its colonial history. Because if you think of, the big names in anthropology, Malinowski, Levi-Strauss, all these people, they were completely working in the colonial context, right? That history won't go away. It marks the history of anthropology. It's, you can't erase that. It's going to be there forever. But the way of thinking about this, or one of the contemporary ways of thinking about this, is that anthropology becomes a collaborative science in which people work together rather than the observer studying and researching the observed. So that the person who's quote unquote observed, or the object of study, becomes also the subject of study.
Right.
That's the kind of solution that I would propose. But again, I'm not an expert on anthropology. There might be anthropologists here who know way more about this than I do. I'm a literary scholar who dabbles in anthropology. So that's my answer.
Thank you. Thank you so much. Well, we are receiving a lot of questions and a few are popping in the chat, but due to paucity of time, this is the final question of the final plenary session that we'll be taking up, dear audience. So the last question goes like this, because I found you talking about, the world becoming a global village when it comes to this intersection between the disciplines. And of course, we in India have been speaking about Vasudhaiva Kutumbakam. I'm sure you must be aware of this concept, the theme. And with this, I think when we have the differences across the globe, plus the whole world coming together as one global village, impacting the differences along with the unity. The next and the final question justifies, which asks, what can be the importance of the overlap between the cross-cultural studies and comparative literature on one hand, and folklore on the other in the present day?
Okay. I'm not entirely clear what is meant by cross-cultural studies. What do we mean by that?
Well, this has been asked by Ms. Astha Parmar. So I think if she's not if she's not there in the room to maybe clarify, we can just go ahead with the intersections.
I can try to work on an answer to that question.
Sure.
I think one interesting way of viewing the history of an academic field, in this case literary studies, is to broaden our view of its history, right? And to see that when a field attempts to establish itself, what it's trying to do is partly engage in what I would call a rhetorical performance, right? A rhetorical performance of what it does as a discipline. If I take you back to this slide here, I'll try to explain to you what I mean. Where are we? This one. So when the early definers of comparative literature in the US were trying to outline their field, you can see that they were really straining to say that this is a natural science, or this is close to a natural science, right? We're systematizing, we're explaining the origin and growth of something, we're looking at types, we're evolutionists. These are the things that we're doing, right? So that by looking at the history of literary studies in relation to other fields that saw themselves as scientific. So, for example, early anthropology, which I might call cross-cultural studies, saw itself as scientific. So did folklore studies. It was attempting to outline itself as a scientific discipline. What we find is that literary studies takes on some of the arguments from these other fields. And the point that I would make today is that is still completely happening, right? Academic disciplines are always in a war with the other disciplines in order to establish why they're the most important discipline, why they should get more funding, do all those things. If we look at literary studies today, we can see that these natural scientific gestures of literary studies continue, right? especially digital humanities, the idea that, you can have a new form of literary studies that is able to have hypotheses and test them by data mining huge corpora of texts.
Mhm.
That's one very good example of how literary studies today is still doing what it was in the late 19th century. So that if we look at literary studies in relation to folklore studies, in relation to cross-cultural studies or anthropology, when it was formed, we can see that the things that it was doing in its struggle for existence then are in some ways quite close to the things that it's doing today in the struggle for existence, right? Academic disciplines always struggle for their existence, always attempt to make rhetorical claims for why they are important. So that would be the historical insight that I would offer your audience. I'm not entirely sure that I've answered the question that I was asked, but I found a way of offering you, I hope, another interesting answer.
No, you have totally done justice to all the questions. Thank you so much indeed, sir. It was truly a scholarly feast that we just witnessed in the final plenary session. And undoubtedly, a spectrum of enlightening talks that we experienced in this EL Summit 2023. I can't thank Professor Nicholls enough for allowing us to explore the world of folklore seamlessly, understand the nuances of popular tales, delve deeper into the mutual interactions between philology, anthropology, ethnology, and comparative literature. We thoroughly enjoyed the exploration of this multiculturalism, fusion, and multidisciplinary studies. I'm sure the audience must have noted a lot of insightful takeaways. And with this, we come to an end of the final plenary session. Thank you so much once again to the audience and, of course, our expert speaker.